everybody. Welcome to the Rupa Subramanya Show. I'm Rupa Subramanya. Today, I'm going to be speaking to Aaron Kimberly. He's a transsexual man and a mental health nurse who's worked with gender dysphoric youth. He's co-founded the Gender Dysphoria Alliance, which seeks to facilitate a more evidence-based, less ideological conversations about gender dysphoria. Given how polarized the trans debate has become recently, I'm very eager to chat with Aaron about his own transition journey and the way forward. Aaron, welcome to the show. It's a real pleasure to have you here with me. Let me just start by asking about your own, you've written about your own gender dysphoria leading to what you've termed opposite sex social mirroring, and that in the majority of such cases, young people experiencing this are probably gay, and that the gender dysphoria condition may disappear over time. Could you share with us your own experience? I believe you went through a period of being a lesbian before you transitioned.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So I would have what the textbooks would call childhood onset gender dysphoria, starting at about age 3, which for the childhood onset type, that's usually when it starts as some sort of self-perception of yourself as the opposite sex. And research has shown that the vast majority of the time that childhood onset gender dysphoria is highly correlated with being gay or lesbian, and tends to, as you said, it tends to shed off through adolescence and the awakening and the development of a gay or lesbian identity. For a small number of people, that doesn't resolve into adulthood. And historically, we are typically the ones that we're transitioning as adults. Most people, when they think of a transgender person, that's probably what they think of, is a highly effeminate gay man or a very masculine gay woman. Though that's, I think the reality of the majority of people who transition don't fit that criteria, which I think for a lot of people would be a surprise to know that there are different types of gender dysphoria and different pathways. So the gay or lesbian pathway is one of the smaller pathways. So in terms of my own experience, it was a very difficult thing to articulate as a young child. I could sense that something wasn't right, and I sensed this perception of myself as male. So that the classic things that we would hear of, I would say, apply to me. Feeling like something had gone wrong, that a mistake had somehow been made, and I don't like the language of born in the wrong body. That's not language that I personally use, because I think that's problematic for various reasons. But that sense that a mistake had been made and that somehow I was in fact male. What I didn't know at the time was that I also had an intersex condition, a rare one called an ovotesticular DSD, which I didn't know I had until age 19. I was having a lot of gynecological problems and hormone imbalances, and I had developed a large cyst on what was thought to be an ovary at the time. So the surgeon went in to remove that, and he said that it was so damaged by the cyst that they had to remove all of it, and sent it for biopsy, and that's when the ovotesticular disorder was discovered. And so he didn't really explain much to me about what that was. He seemed a little bit kind of awkward and embarrassed. So I picked up on that cue, and his reassurance to me was that it had since been removed and wouldn't pose a problem for me anymore. It is apparently a cancer risk. And so he said it was good that it had been removed. And he didn't know that I experienced gender dysphoria, though I've since learned, just in my own reading about the disorder, that it is associated with a very high rate of gender dysphoria, almost a 50-50 chance. They have a difficult time. If it was diagnosed as a baby, they have a difficult time determining which sex that child is going to feel an identification with. It's probably the highest rate of all of the intersex conditions. Not all intersex conditions are related, have an association with gender dysphoria. But when the current DSM criteria for gender dysphoria was written, they written it with a DSD or intersex subtype, because certain intersex conditions are associated with a higher rate of cross-sex identification and want to change their sex legally as an adult, and wanted to make sure that there was a pathway for us to be able to access those services. Because with the gender identity disorder, which was the previous name for the condition, that intersex pathway hadn't been part of that diagnostic criteria.
Okay. So, what made you ultimately decide to transition? And I believe you transitioned when you were in your 30s, I believe. That's what I read somewhere. And so that's pretty late for a person to be transitioning, I imagine. So what made you decide that?
Well, back then, I mean, 20 years ago, that wasn't late. They weren't really transitioning young kids at that time. But I grew up in a small town in Manitoba.
Okay.
So I didn't have access to either intersex services or transition services. That wasn't something that I even knew existed. And I had a lot of, when I did learn about it years later, I was skeptical. I assumed that there would be a lot of health risks involved. And so it seemed far-fetched, and I was afraid to take the medical option. But so it really wasn't until I moved to Vancouver and met other trans people and learned more about it and what the health risks were and what they weren't, when it started to feel like a real possibility for me. But the way that, because I had no way of articulating it as a child, so I had no help for it as a child. I didn't tell anybody about it until I went to the gender clinic as an adult. Because I had no framework through which to understand it. When I was diagnosed with the intersex condition, I just chalked it up to these two things are somehow related. And I just did my best to kind of limp through it. But as I got older and older, the symptoms of it became worse and worse. And in hindsight, I've tried to find ways of articulating it with more nuance, because some of these catchphrases like "born in the wrong body," they've become as problematic as they are helpful to helping people understand our experiences. So I've tried to sort of dig through my memories and find a language to better describe how it felt. And if you've ever been on like a Zoom meeting or a phone call where your own voice is being echoed back to you, that it oftentimes creates a very strong discomfort. I've had people say, well, I need to hang up this phone call and try again, because it's such an uncomfortable feeling. That's hard to articulate, right? To ask anyone, well, why is that uncomfortable for you? I don't think they'd be able to articulate why. It just causes this kind of this cognitive discomfort. And to the extent that people will end a phone call because of that discomfort. So that was a very similar sensation that I experienced anytime I had to acknowledge my biological sex or consider which sex category I belonged in, would cause a very similar sort of cognitive discomfort, and that's what I would call dysphoria, is just that discomfort. And so anytime I saw myself in a mirror or caught my reflection in a store window or heard my voice on a recording, I would anytime I had to acknowledge my biological sex, I experienced that little cognitive glitch that did cause me a lot of distress. So if you can imagine the distress it might cause you on a Zoom call, imagining going through life with every social interaction, every time you saw your reflection, it's hard to go through life avoiding that sensation. So it did become an impairment to my functioning because it was such a distraction. Every time I'm having a conversation with somebody, or if I'm in a business meeting or on a phone call and I'm experiencing that discomfort, it's a burden. It's a heavy burden to go through life with.
Yeah.
And so my intention with transition was hoping that little glitch that was happening in my mind would resolve. And for the most part, I would say that transition did do that. And it did help with my functioning. And I mean, it caused other problems. I mean, it's not a medically neutral intervention. and I, experienced surgical complications and those kinds of things, but it did resolve that psychological glitch, which has helped me to function better socially and occupationally.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's one of the things that people don't often discuss are the complications that arise from this kind of surgery and this kind of treatment. I mean, if it's really up to you, what are some things that you experienced? And I also wanted to ask you, that's if you're comfortable sharing that with us. I also wanted to ask you, I mean, you transitioned about 20 years ago. It was, I imagine it was fairly new at that time. The treatment options, things are a lot different now. I believe there's a lot of stuff happening in that space. How do you contrast the two, the two time periods as far as transitioning is concerned?
Yeah, so in terms of some of the differences, I mean, in Vancouver, it wasn't entirely new. I think Vancouver was one of the early adopters, and I mean, some of the people that I met had transitioned, 6 to 10 years before I did even, but there was a lot more assessment. I wasn't that familiar with the WPATH standards of care at the time that I went into the clinic, but it was the beginnings of the previous standards of care. So that would have been SOC 6, I guess, at the time that I transitioned. So back then there was in that standards of care, the requirement for the real life test, which is a 1-year period of living to the best of your ability as the opposite sex before you would qualify for interventions, and a very lengthy assessment process. But the clinic that I went to, I think, was one of the early adopters of a more informed consent model. And so they didn't require that I do the real life test. I did go through an assessment process over about a 3-month period before starting hormones. And then I had to see a psychologist again before any surgeries, and then another assessment again before any other surgeries. So there was a lot more assessment back then, but it was still the beginnings of what we now call the affirmative model. So there was no pushback. There was no education about what gender dysphoria is, and there was no requirement for psychotherapy or for a real life test. Mm-hmm. And that was 10 years before the standards of care even changed. So they really weren't following. And people say, well, everyone's following the standards of care. But when I transitioned about 16 years ago, they weren't following the standards of care, and they still don't really. There's a lot of clinics that don't follow the standards of care.
So would you say that things are a little more what's the term, like things are a little looser now, laxer now compared to how they were about 20 years ago?
Yeah, well, because I'm a registered nurse, it's worked in mental health. And so the clinic I was working for started to do some trans care for young people, for youth ages. We weren't transitioning anyone at 12, but the clinic saw people from 12 to 25. And so we were receiving training to do that work. And the message that I was getting, because I had been under the presumption that things were the same as it was when I went through the system. So our clinic was planning on doing careful, detailed assessment and case management with young people. And I quickly discovered that that's not how people are practicing anymore. I was told, this could be done in a single visit. And that the purpose of the assessment was really just to determine the capacity to consent, that there was no real requirement of gender dysphoria anymore, so that diagnosis didn't need to be made. And we were given a 1-page checklist of things to go through with the clients, but it wasn't really clear what do we do with that information. So it did ask about medical history and psychiatric history. But I asked, so if someone does have a psychiatric condition, what do we do with that information? We're supposed to ask about it, but what are we supposed to do with that information? And I was told, well, people have a right to be both trans and mentally ill. So basically we do, as long as it didn't interfere with their ability to provide consent, then we don't really do anything with that information. We just give people what they want. Mm-hmm. And that started to really concern me, because the youth that I was seeing in our clinic were highly complex with multiple issues going on. Like some of them had autism or ADHD or trauma backgrounds, sexual abuse backgrounds. And I felt like we needed to take our time and more care to get to know these youth and make sure that they knew what they were getting themselves into and that it was going to be an appropriate intervention for them.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you have this unique perspective of not only having transition, but you also worked in the space, counseling young people. Did you see that the medical profession and you were sometimes at odds with each other when it came to these young people?
Yeah, I really didn't find that my ideas or my concerns were very welcome in the system. And that really started to concern me, that I felt like it was an environment of coercion and control, that people weren't allowed to really think critically or to have a different opinion or to ask certain questions. Those kinds of conversations were shut down very quickly. So I just withdrew myself from the care altogether. I didn't feel comfortable in that kind of practice environment. I didn't feel like it was safe or ethical care for these young people. And so I just removed myself from that responsibility of providing that care. I did have people message me privately and saying, other clinicians who shared my concerns, but it wasn't an environment in which anyone is allowed to speak openly.
Why is that? What is going on here? I ask this question to everyone in this space that I have these conversations with. Why is that? Especially here in Canada, where doctors are not necessarily making a whole lot of money given our socialized system. In the US, one could make this argument that it's driven by commercial interests. There's a lot of money to be made by some of these clinics and doctors. But what's going on here? Is it ideology that is driving this? They're really steeped in this ideology that they will not entertain dissenting voices, especially someone who's actually transitioned, and you're saying, hey, wait a minute, I think we need to take time with these people because there are also mental health issues at play here before we put them on this irreversible path of transitioning. What is going on here?
Yeah, I was really surprised by it because I had been out of the loop for a number of years. I mean, yes, I'm a trans man, but I wasn't connected to any trans community. I've got a few close friends that I've maintained over the years that I met when I first transitioned and needed the services, but then we just went on and lived our lives. And one of the things that really concerned me was while I was being told that, any conversation about things like detransition, for example, or transition regret is just propaganda. And the accusation was A, that I was gatekeeping, and B, that I was sharing propaganda. But meanwhile, I mean, some of my closest friends that transitioned around the same time I did were starting to unpack their experience and their transition. And two of them very much regret their transitions. They haven't detransitioned, but they do regret it. And one has said that his transition had more to do with his childhood sexual abuse. That as over the years, as he worked through that trauma, he came to the realization that was his motivation. The other has recently been diagnosed with autism and feels that is a better fit for what he was experiencing. And he's quite angry about that kind of misdiagnosis because when he transitioned, he lost his entire family. They disowned him. And so that was a lot of loss for him. And now realizing that he probably never even had gender dysphoria in the first place. But back to your question, I do. So it's alarming for me because when I transitioned, we talked about gender identity disorder within the gay and lesbian community. Some of the butch lesbians that I'd known over the years, very highly masculine women, physically and, in terms of, mannerisms and interests. And they would describe having an experience of gender identity disorder. Some of them transitioned and some of them didn't. So that was something that we talked about. And I remember, I'm old enough to remember a lot of these people prior to transition and having seen them go through a transition. So I remember who we all were before transitioning. And we were highly effeminate gay, a few highly effeminate gay men, a few highly masculine gay women. And the majority were people that I didn't really have any social contact with. They were heterosexual men who were maybe cross-dressers or part of the kink community, or that I didn't really know well, but they seemed to be the majority. So that was understood 20 years ago that there's different things going on, different cohorts of people transitioning. So coming back into the work and into the fold, it was almost a creepy experience for me to say things that I just thought were common sense about talking about different pathways to gender dysphoria, and that the clinicians, it's almost as if there's a type of amnesia that's gone on, that they don't seem to remember, these different pathways and the work that had been done and all the research that had been done into these different pathways. And so I do chalk it up to ideological capture.
Mm-hmm.
I think people that do this work tend to specialize in this work and tend to socialize in the community as well. Many times come from the community and do this work. And I think when you are in a certain very specific social bubble that all starts to think and act and behave the same way, I think it becomes difficult to think outside of that box. And so that's how I chalk it up, is most of the clinicians that I knew of in that it was a listserv and the mentorship group, socialize within the queer community. And I just don't think they interact with people outside of that community very much, and have just accepted this very particular way of thinking.
Yeah, I mean, sticking to this, you've written and commented about queer theory, which is an academic theory, I believe part of the broader postmodernism movement. The basic idea being that gender is just a construction or performance, and it's a tool of oppression. You write that in some ways this is liberating for trans people, but ultimately it's had a damaging effect on society. What exactly do you mean by this?
Well, I mean, back when I was in university as a 20-something-year-old back in early 90s, was the beginnings of queer theory in academia, and it was in the Department of Literary Criticism, just to kind of contextualize where these theories come from. So you're right. Exactly. That they're a branch of postmodernism. And when we studied it, we were looking at social philosophy and literature, and interpreting literature through the lens of these philosophies. Somehow, those theories have become conflated with the condition of gender dysphoria. And that's my biggest concern, is that basically a political movement has co-opted our understanding of both intersex conditions, which are rare medical conditions, and gender dysphoria, which is a psychological condition. And so I feel like the medical community is no longer seeking answers about these conditions, and they're no longer providing people education about these conditions. And I don't know how to articulate it, how alarming it is for a political movement to have hijacked clinical conditions and have opened the gateway for people who don't even have these conditions to access the interventions. I guess an analogy I could use is, let's say there was this sort of political philosophical movement that had certain ideas about psychosis, that maybe they believed that the state of psychosis was, a highly advanced spiritual state, and they co-opted the treatment of schizophrenia. And not only that, but went into schools and convinced kids, well, if you hear voices, you have this special ability, and we're going to worship you, and we're going to elevate you, and we're going to celebrate how awesome this ability is. And then also, medicalized them along with people that had schizophrenia. I mean, that would be pretty alarming, and that sounds far-fetched, but that is essentially what's happened with the treatment of gender dysphoria, is a political philosophical movement that started in academia in the early 90s, has completely taken over our understanding of this condition and our treatment of this condition, and is going into schools telling kids that having this condition is somehow brave and awesome and wonderful, and more people should adopt this way of thinking.
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary how this academic theory, which, at one point was confined to left-wing humanities departments at universities, has completely come to take over our understanding of gender and sexuality. It is quite alarming.
Right. It's really dividing our society. And I think it is I think we had achieved a certain amount of social acceptance as trans people. In the early 2000s, I think was our peak moment, and it was through efforts like old civil rights movements, and based on trying to build bridges with people and develop trust and help people understand our experience. That's how we were trying, how we were able to achieve a certain amount of social acceptance. But I think that's very quickly being unraveled because of these theories, because not everyone agrees with postmodernism. Not everyone agrees with how these ideas are being packaged and sold to our kids. And it's fueling a lot more hostility and a lot more division, I think, between the entire LGBT movement and the general public. I think we're seeing more hostility, more backlash, more division. And that's not what I want. I would rather people understand my experience. It's an unusual experience. I don't try to normalize it in the sense that I think this is something that everyone should aspire to feel. It's a condition that I wouldn't wish on anybody. But I think that educating people on the reality of that is far more effective than trying to shove postmodern theory down people's throats. But I think those postmodern theories are now been taken up at levels of national and international government. And it's starting to be written into law and policy, like our conversion therapy laws, for example. And I in no way condone conversion therapy, but the way that was written, it was very underhanded. It was very much a backdoor way of writing queer theory into law.
You've been critical of the way gender dysphoria is treated clinically. You're not in favor, for example, of puberty blockers being prescribed right off the bat to a child who's experiencing gender dysphoria. What do you think should the right approach be, and what should the role of parents and teachers be in this process?
I'm having reviewed a lot of the literature and talked to many clinicians. I'm of the opinion that the watchful waiting approach was most appropriate, for the reason that there are now 13 different studies that all say the same thing, that when you followed those kids long enough, the vast majority of the kids with gender dysphoria did resolve it through puberty and became healthy, happy gay lesbian adults. Knowing that isn't the information that families or kids are being given today. We're being taught this concept that there is such a thing as a trans child, and that these children would benefit from being transitioned as early as possible. Now, it's easy for adults who have transitioned later in life to have the wishful thinking, I wish I could have done this as a child, and imagining some of the benefits of that. But I don't see the rationale for slapping a trans label on a child, knowing that about 85% of those kids would resolve it through puberty. And it's not that I necessarily think, it's awful to be trans and that it's an awful outcome, but it does mean lifelong medicalization. So for me, it's the difference between avoiding lifelong medicalization and some of the potential complications versus not having to be medicalized. And it seems highly unethical to me to transition, to tell all of these kids that they're trans and that the pathway then is medicalization. And they're not being told what gender dysphoria really is, even though they're, the two main pathways to gender dysphoria have been well studied. There's still a lot more research that could be done to better understand it, but I don't think that those two pathways are disputable at this point.
Yeah, that's extraordinary. How does a child benefit from transitioning? Does their life automatically just all of a sudden change? In your case, you transitioned as an adult. And as an adult, you have this agency. You can do what you want with your body, so to speak. A child really has no agency. They can't vote. They can't do a bunch of different things that you and I can do. But so what is, like, how is this being told to the parents of these children and to the child? Like, you get a mastectomy, you get rid of your various organs, and that you transition to whatever gender you're transitioning to. That you know, it'll take a few months for the scars to heal, but you'll be like a different person, and you'll be really happy. Is that really what is being sold to these kids?
It well, what's being sold to the families is that these kids will all commit suicide if they're not
Ah,
medicalized.
I
So
see.
so parents are being told that, and there's no evidence to that effect. So I think it's really inappropriate to tell families that when we have there's no evidence that there's a direct path from not being immediately medicalized and suicide. I mean, there is evidence that people with this condition are more likely to have other mental health issues like depression and anxiety, and are on average have more suicidal ideation. But we can't say for certain that suicidal ideation is directly because of the gender dysphoria. We don't know that. I mean, the suicidality rates are higher for most any mental health condition, including kids that have ADHD, autism, any number of other conditions, social isolation, or being gay or lesbian. But there's certainly no evidence that these kids are all going to act on those thoughts if they're not immediately medicalized. So that's really, I think, a kind of emotional blackmail for these parents who are now afraid that if I don't go along with this and accept these treatments, that my child is
going to
going to
lose my
harm themselves.
I'm going to lose my child, basically. So there's a lot of fear mongering at play here as well, as from the medical community. It's all quite tragic. I mean, I was reading something that you wrote, and this quote really jumped at me. Why are we putting all of our resources into escaping brutality rather than eliminating brutality? We're cutting up our bodies because our lived reality is worse. Why do we celebrate that? And then, end quote. And that's precisely what is happening here, where I see these horrific photos of young kids who are not even old enough to drive, proudly displaying their bodies in these photos, that they no longer have breasts and they're on hormone therapy and so on and so forth. And I just why are we celebrating this? What are we celebrating here exactly?
Yeah, it's puzzling, isn't it? I mean, I wouldn't have done this if it weren't for a great deal of distress and poor functioning, which certainly isn't something to celebrate. But I get, in terms of some of the youth that I was meeting with and assessing, I didn't get the sense that they even had gender dysphoria, and that concerned me. I mean, our health authorities website even says that you don't have to be trans to access gender affirming care. So at this point, trans has become a very meaningless if it doesn't mean gender dysphoria, and if it doesn't mean, I mean, I don't even know what trans means. So there's basically no criteria for accessing these interventions except somebody wanting it. And I think there could be potentially many reasons for why a young person might imagine that their life would somehow be better if they were the opposite sex.
Yeah. You mentioned that a couple of your friends who transitioned around the same time as you did have come to regret it for various reasons. How do people like that deal with their where they find themselves after having transitioned and now they regret it? Like, I know you can't speak for them, but generally, what happens to such folks? I'm assuming that there's a lot of mental health issues at play here. How do they go on with their daily lives? I mean, what's going on? Are there resources to help deal with such individuals? I mean, we put a lot of resources, it seems, into getting kids on puberty blockers and getting people to transition, but are there resources to deal with people who regret transition?
There really aren't resources for regret, and and when it's being sold as this is, the very mention of regret is just propaganda, anti-trans propaganda. It makes it very difficult to even explore creating services, because the activists would come after us saying this is anti-trans. So how do you start to talk about and create services for people that do regret it, who are often ostracized from the existing services. And fortunately, I mean, the two friends that I have enough inner resolve and inner resources and friends and family around them that they're okay. I mean, they're grieving, they're upset, but I think, you know, they're still functioning, they're still okay. But I mean, I imagine that there are people with fewer inner resources, right, or not a lot of support around them who would really struggle with that realization that they've made a horrible mistake.
Yeah, I mean that's really quite tragic. I can't even imagine what they must be going through. Um, because I don't really know the medical side of this issue, once you've detransitioned, once you've transitioned and you're just unhappy with what the decision that you made, can you just stop taking all of your medication? And if you do so, what happens?
Well, depending on what stage someone is at, like if somebody has taken the steps to remove either their ovaries or their testicles, their bodies aren't producing any hormones anymore. So depending on how old they are, you know, their health would be at risk if they didn't have any hormones, either testosterone or estrogen. So they would have to have some sort of hormone replacement therapy for the rest of their lives.
Okay, so they would be on that for the rest of their lives, and for those who transitioned, they're also on hormones and all kinds of other things for the rest of their lives, or does it just like you've transitioned, that's it, you no longer have to take these medicines, no longer have to undergo these treatments? Is that how it works generally?
Yeah, the biggest concern I think would be the bone health. So if I were to just stop taking testosterone, for example,
Okay.
I mean, none of those interventions are going to reverse themselves. I'm not going to grow the hair back on my head. I'm not going to lose the hair that's grown on my face and body.
Yeah.
None of the parts that have been surgically removed are going to grow back. And so I'm at an age now, I mean, I'm 50 now, so I could probably get through the rest of my life without hormones at this stage. I mean, I would probably be facing menopause if I still had ovaries anyway.
Okay.
But if I was 20 or 30, I would be concerned about my long-term bone health if I didn't have any hormones in my body. So I would either have to continue taking testosterone or I would have to switch to estrogen in order to protect my bone health.
Yeah. You've written also, Aaron, that self-identification by some men who claim to be women merely by self-identifying as women has created problems in various places, like assaults on women in locker rooms, prisons, etc. Also, it's worth noting that it's wreaking havoc in the world of professional sports, where a man can self-identify as a woman and break records. Obviously, this is not a level playing field. How do you think, as a society, we should deal with this?
And I know I've been accused of picking on the trans women a lot, but you know, it's not an even playing field when we're talking about biological males who transition and biological females. I don't think anyone would be concerned if I joined a sports team because I'm not going to beat the men. But self-ID does concern me. I think self-ID is a huge mistake that the trans community is making. You know, I see this as it's a legal fiction that we've entered into as part of our treatment. It's like a social contract. We don't ever literally change sex. It's a treatment for a condition. So I think we need proper diagnosis of that condition and proper education about that condition, and in order to receive a treatment for it. I think in the long run, that idea is protective of the trans community, because this legal fiction that we've been granted requires that the public at large feels okay with this social contract, that we have responsibilities in this social contract, not just rights or privileges. And I think this social contract has to be mutually agreeable. And if we start to disrupt or put communities at risk of harm in some way, I think it then becomes understandable if the community or society says, okay, this legal contract, this social contract that we have here isn't working. So I think what self-ID does is it opens the door for all kinds of bad players to take advantage of the system. We've already seen that in Canada. We've seen men who have raped children, suddenly IDing as trans in prison and being transferred into female prisons. It's my understanding, part of the intake process now in so many places, not just prisons, but often when you're doing paperwork, you're asked about which sex you are, what gender you are on a lot of intake forms, including prisons. And so if you line up a bunch of rapists or murderers and basically ask them, would you rather go to the male prison or the female prison? It's not hard to imagine that some men in that position would say, well, I'd much rather go to the female prison. The prison that this individual who raped a child some years ago transferred to a female prison that has a mother and baby ward in this prison. I mean, how is that appropriate? I mean, that obviously puts people at great risk, and it does me no favors as a trans person when people abuse the system in this way in order to harm others.
Yeah, so I believe we're thinking about the same person. I was reading up on this about a month ago. This person has transitioned. They have undergone therapy, hormone therapy, and all of that stuff, and now they identify as a woman. I believe it's the same person.
That could be. I think there's a few different cases here in Canada, but some of these individuals, because I don't think there's even a requirement all the time that people have to go through any transition process.
I was going to ask you about that because, when we say self-identifying, I imagine that, at least as far as the prison system is concerned, I would think that a bare minimum has to be met in terms of, well, has this person transitioned? I would say that at least is something worth considering. I mean, anybody can identify I can identify as the King of Spain, but that's doesn't make it true. So are you saying that you can just, as a male prisoner, say I'm strongly identifying as a woman, even though I've never undergone any of this treatment, and I'm still hanging on to all of my body parts and everything, and prison is obliged to consider this?
Well, that's my understanding of how self-identification works. I know in the province of BC, they've recently changed the law where anyone can go and change their ID, the gender marker on their ID, without any documentation or without any expectation of any medical interventions. That they've most provinces are now adopting self-ID as part of law, that anyone can just declare which sex they are and have that written on their ID. There was a case in Alberta of a man who self-ID'd as female so that he could get cheaper car insurance.
Okay, I can see so many possibilities with this, but it's just extraordinary the times that we live in. It appears that big businesses have also embraced trans culture in a really big way. There's been a big push, I believe, the last couple of weeks with Dylan Mulvaney. One example really stands out for me with Nike giving him a sponsorship deal for a sports bra, of all things. This has drawn criticism from some very prominent lesbians like former tennis star Martina Navratilova. What is your take on this? I mean, do you think that fundamentally we are at a point in our time where women are being excluded once again?
Well, it certainly does seem that way, doesn't it? I mean, I am impressed that there is an organization. I think Martina is part of that organization, and a number of senior athletes, women and some trans women who are getting together to really have thoughtful, nuanced conversations to find solutions that are fair for everybody. And I applaud those kinds of efforts of balancing social inclusion with fairness. Seeing some of these athletes, who are a good foot taller than all of the other female athletes, competing against them in swimming. I mean, those kinds of cases are so obviously not fair that it's enraging people.
Yeah.
And I understand the outrage. I mean, we have to, this goes back to this idea of this is a legal fiction, that we don't literally change sex. And we have to, when we're writing policies and laws, we have to take biological sex into consideration.
Yeah, I mean, I find Dylan Mulvaney very interesting. I mean, it's mostly theater. He's a performer. I'm actually entertained by much of what he does, like the sports bra thing. I think he was exercising. It was comical. It made me laugh. I don't even know what that is, and but at the same time, it made me concerned that here he is modeling for a sports bra and women women's sports bra, that too. I mean, who else wears a sports bra? But yeah, it's just it's entertaining on the one hand, but on the other, it's also very scary if you're a woman, that once again you find yourself in this situation where we're once again treated as second-class citizens by men.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that, I think Dylan, for the most part, would be fairly harmless if it weren't for these big institutions propping what he's doing up. But I mean, who knows if Dylan even has gender dysphoria? I follow a little bit of Matt Walsh's work, and I think Matt Walsh had a really good point that looking back at footage of Dylan's behavior on things like The Price is Right prior to transition was a very performative, very attention-seeking sort of individual, which leads, to speculation that this is all just a money-making grift, that it's a performance, it's not sincere, it's not gender dysphoria, it's an opportunity to make a lot of money and achieve the fame that Dylan always wanted.
It's entertainment at the end of the day, and that's how I view this one particular individual. At least on face value, it's just sheer entertainment.
And I understand if women find that a mockery, because as a trans person, I find that a mockery as well, to turn it all into just a performance.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Finally, Aaron, you've been critical of the politicization in debates about gender and sexuality. What is the way forward here? Right now, it seems like positions are so polarized that there is that one feels like there is really no common ground here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, our philosophy with the Gender Dysphoria Alliance is to try to find a third way. I mean, we were trying to remove ourselves completely from that gender ideology or the queer theory, and are just trying to dive into the research about what gender dysphoria is, and we're trying to just have conversations based on the reality of what gender dysphoria is. I personally think that's the way forward, is to just have a really honest conversations about what all of this is about and remove that very deceptive lens of queer theory from it. We're not trying to push a specific politic or a certain philosophy. We're just trying to understand for ourselves what gender dysphoria is and grapple with that based on what the actual research says. And our hope is that if we educate others, that will be helpful, and we can problem solve if we kind of really understand, have a good grasp of what we're really talking about.
Yeah.
Rather than the smoke and mirrors that we're all being fed.
Yeah, I mean, I just hope that that we find some kind of middle ground here. At least my own position when it comes to children is that they have no agency, and I don't think the medical community should be pushing them down this path. Adults, it's a different issue. It's your body, your choice. That's where that's my position on that. But I think you rightly point out in many of your writings that anytime you criticize something in the trans space, one is called transphobic. You yourself, I believe, have been called transphobic, which is kind of hilarious. It's a bit like me being called a white supremacist. So, it's just, everything has just become polarized, and I really hope that we find that common ground, for all our sakes, at least, and for the future of our children.
And I think what the left needs to realize is that there's more than one model for social justice, because they seem to think that unless people believe in these postmodern theories, therefore you're a racist, or therefore you're a transphobe or homophobic. And they've forgotten that there are other models for social justice, ones based on individual character. So I would like to see more of that kind of politic and social justice, getting back to the roots of social justice, or civil liberties, and because I think it's these postmodern theories that are creating most of the problem, and it creates that's what's creating so much polarization and division, that people can't criticize critical theory without being immediately branded as phobic of one kind or another. And I think, I like what the work FAIR is doing, if you're familiar with that organization, of addressing civil liberties, from more of the grassroots of what civil rights movements of the past used to be, and trying to carve out space for a new way of addressing things like racism and intolerance in our society without critical theory.
Yeah, no, I actually belong to the Ottawa chapter of FAIR, and it is a wonderful organization, and these are conversations that we frequently have, and I think and more people should be having these conversations moving forward. And I really hope better sense prevails moving forward. It's been a real pleasure to have you with me, Aaron, and I really appreciate all of your insights, your and sharing with us your views. It's been incredibly informative for me. And I really hope that you return to the show and sometime soon, and we'll continue the conversation.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and I'd be happy to talk to you again.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you.